Natalie, you work for Prison Fellowship, and you're both involved in something called the Sycamore Tree course. Could you maybe tell me just a little bit about what that course involves and what does it look like?
Yeah, the Sycamore Tree course is a 6-week course that we run with 20 learners, and we run it in about 34 prisons across England and Wales. And it creates a space for the learners to think about it with volunteers who stand alongside them. The reason they're in prison in the first place, it helps them to think about the impact of their crime on the victim. And it's on week 3 that they get to meet a victim. And Lynn very kindly has come in to many of our courses and spoken to the men and women who've been learning there.
Okay. And Lynn, how are you kind of involved then in that course?
Thank you. Well, as Natalie said, I go in on week 3 and I share my story as a victim of crime. So it's very different sharing it there to anywhere else I've found. So.
And would you like to tell me a little bit about the story?
Yes. So, well, it began really in 2002. As you can tell, I'm from Liverpool, so I'll try and speak slowly so you can understand me. But Mick's here with me today, my husband, and we pastor a church in Wavertree. And in 2002, I remember I was looking after my 2 granddaughters, well, 1 granddaughter. One of them was in hospital overnight. She'd been hit by a swing, and she was in Alderhay Hospital. And so I was looking after Jenna, who was 8 at the time. And I can remember coming out of the supermarket, and on my way home, I realised I'd forgotten my key. And as I went round the back of the house, I came in to the room, and Mick was sitting there. And I remember 2 strangers on the settee, and they sort of ushered my granddaughter out of the room. And I remember just saying, Mick, just tell me what's happened. And he told me that our son, Paul, had been murdered. As you can imagine, it was just the worst day of my life. Paul was 28, in the prime of his life, and he was about to be engaged. And so we were planning a wedding in our house, and now all of a sudden we were planning a funeral. So it was just devastating all round, as you can imagine. So that really was the beginning of the journey into the prison work. So Lynn, I go in and share that on week 3.
Lynn, to go from that point into a prison, I imagine that's the last place you'd want to go.
It was. Just 6 weeks after Paul died, I heard of something called Impact, which stands for In Merseyside, Police and Church Together. And because of what had happened to us, I was wondering what God was doing with the police and the church together. And I went along to a meeting where the Chief of Police was there at the time, and 250 Christians from every denomination, and they just really were asking for prayer coordinators. And for me, I felt it was a gift from God because I didn't know how I was going to continue the rest of my life. What do you do when something so huge happens? I didn't know how I was going to get through the next 10 minutes, let alone the rest of my life. And I saw this as a gift from God, that it was my way forward. And I just got involved in being a link with the police. And I noticed the Christian police are here today. And Impact was begun by 2 police officers who were Christians. And what they wanted was to give me a link person in the police, and then I was to get out to the church in Merseyside, in Liverpool South, their concerns. And I was content. I thought, Lord, I'd love to do that. And so that really began the journey. And then I met Chris Tierney from Prison Fellowship, and I actually met him at a funeral. And Chris said to me, would I go in on a restorative justice course, which I didn't know what it was. And he explained to me about the sycamore tree course. And he asked, would I go in as a victim of crime to share my story on week 3. So that was how I got from working alongside the police. To me, prison work followed very easily in with the police work. And this is just weeks after Paul died, so it's God's good.
And so I was there once when you were talking to a group of 20 men at Forest Bank, and I could see the impact you were having on them, that you could have had a pin drop. Can you tell us a bit about the people you've met through telling your story?
Yes, it sounds odd really, but I've met the tenderest hearts in prison. Sometimes more tender than the church. But, and just people who don't look like they belong there, and yet they've done terrible things. My first experience was in Walton Prison, and I'd never had any contact with the prison before, but I'm just this ordinary housewife, you know, and as I walked in, I remember saying to the Lord, this is a one-off, God. I don't know whether I can get through this today, but I'm here. And as I walked in, I can remember going up the stairs to the chapel and thinking, why isn't there a lift? But there isn't. I don't know what the reason is, but I remember arriving at the chapel, which was a big room, and 15 men were coming on the course, and I heard that they were from the Lifer unit. So to me, it was like meeting the people who'd killed my son. You know, I felt very intimidated as I went in. And I remember feeling fearful. And as they came in, one young man, he had dark circles under his eyes. And I remember thinking he just looked so empty. And he looked like he was on drugs to me, and he sort of scowled at me. And I remember just looking down, you know, but I could feel the tears before I even began to share my story. I could feel the tears come. And but then as they sat, they just sort of sat in a semicircle. Some of them just sat on the floor. And as I began to share my story, I don't know what I expected, but certainly not what happened. I can remember thinking, they're going to swear, they're going to talk when I'm talking, they're not going to be the slightest bit interested. And it wasn't like that at all. As I began to share about what happened to Paul, you know, people's gaze would go to the floor, and I could tell that for a lot of them, our son was stabbed to death, and for a lot of them there, that was their crime. And probably seeing somebody face to face as a victim of crime, and I just sobbed my way all the way through my story. But I can remember they just really disarmed me, because I was expecting to feel maybe angry, or I don't know, I just didn't know what I'd feel like. But like Christian said, you know, I looked out and I just felt God's love for these people. And, you know, although the people who killed Paul have never ever said sorry, these people did. And they were just listening so intently. And as I'm talking about, you know, the horror of what happened, you know, they just listened to me. And not many people actually want to listen to your pain. But I found that these people listened, and they didn't interrupt, you know, and afterwards they said to me, well, you weren't really what we were expecting either. They expected someone to come and yell at them, to shout at them for what they'd done, and to scream and carry on. And I just very calmly told them my story. And it was just an amazing time. You know, it's been the worst time of my life, but the best time of my life as well.